Welcome to Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. I am Joel Chasnoff. Today is April 2nd, 2024. And the title of tonight's episode is This Time It's Personal. What I really want to do tonight is communicate to you why what's happening in Israel right now is so personal to those of us who live there. It's not just about policy, it's not just about mistakes or decisions made or not made by the government on some abstract level. What's happening in Israel is so personal to those who are living there. And I really think that the more I travel around the US and do speaking events and comedy shows, I really find that this is one of the big divides between the world Jewish community and Jews living in Israel. I feel like for the world Jewish community, a lot of what's happening in Israel, whether it's the war, the hostages, the political situation, it's very troublesome on sort of an abstract level as an idea, but I feel like Jews outside of Israel don't fully relate to just how much it's impacting the lives of Israelis and how really personal it is and the angst and the suffering that Israelis are going through. So today I want to try to delve into that a little bit with a few stories that relate to that idea. And we're going to start with a friend of my daughter's named Nathan Weil. Nathan Weil is, like I said, a friend of my 23-year-old twins. He himself is 23 years old. And he's been to my apartment several times to hang out. I don't know him very well, but he's a friend of my kids, so he's a friend of ours. And a few days ago, Nathan Weil's younger brother, Sivan, was killed in Gaza. Sivan was a soldier in a unit that's called Egoz. If you read Israeli media to get your news, you'll probably notice this army unit coming up a lot. It's a very elite unit. It's often referred to as just the commando unit. They are trained for these crack situations. They are trained to work in small teams, to go and conduct urban warfare, to rescue hostages. Any kind of special mission is really the MO of Egoz. And we have other friends of our family whose son is serving in Egoz. And so I know a little bit about this unit. And Egoz has been very involved in the 2-week raid of Shifa Hospital, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the broadcast as well. But as you may know, because I've touched on it, the IDF conducted a large raid on Shifa Hospital, which might be sort of surprising because Shifa Hospital was the hospital that Israel found, I think, 3 months ago to be the base of operations of Hamas. And Israel was able to both demonstrate to the world that this was a base of operations for Hamas by showing the computer terminals and the weapons that had been hidden in the ICU unit, but also we were able to clear Hamas out of the hospital. So you might be wondering, well, why did we have to go back in and do this raid? Well, over the past few months, as we've been operating in Gaza, we've not only been killing, now the number is well over 13,000 Hamas militants, but we've been taking hundreds and hundreds, if not over 1,000, of prisoners. Hamas militants, we've been questioning them and getting intelligence. And one thing that the IDF discovered was that Hamas was planning to go back to Shifa Hospital and start using it as a base of operations again. The thinking being that the IDF had already been there and would not go back a second time. Now, I don't know this officially, but the word that I'm hearing is that the IDF simply allowed Hamas to go back to Shifa once they got this intelligence. The idea being that once we felt there was a critical mass of Hamas there at Shifa once again, we would raid and kill as many as possible and capture those that we could. And that's exactly what we did. It was really only supposed to be a few days. It lasted 2 weeks, and it was a very heavy operation with several hundred Hamas militants, I believe well over 200 killed, and 500 confirmed Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants taken prisoner. Again, this is so vital because we can question them and get intelligence for future operations, for the location of hostages. And Sivan Weil and his Agos unit were a part of these operations. And at one point, they were holing up in an apartment building nearby, and Hamas fired an RPG at the apartment building. And Sivan Weil, who was just 20 years old, the younger brother of my daughter's friend Nathan, was killed. And my wife is friends with his mother, and so it's very personal. That's my point. This is happening all over Israel. These deaths of soldiers, they are not merely statistics and numbers. They are the people we know. My 23-year-old twins have already been to, I've lost count how many funerals since October 7th, both of friends who died at the Nova Rave and soldiers who were killed in Gaza. The numbers of Shivas that they have gone to and that other families are going to, it's not normal. It's not normal that 23-year-olds should be going to multiple funerals of people their age or younger in the span of any amount of time, but let alone in the span of less than half a year. And so this war in Gaza, is so personal for Israelis. When we talk about whether or not to go into Rafah, Rafiah, the last big city in southern Gaza, it's not just about strategy or the likelihood, the probability of capturing the hostages. It's about soldiers like Sivan Weil and how many more of them are we willing to sacrifice in order to accomplish our mission. It's about the West Bank. You know, the reason that so many Israelis, myself included, are so fed up with the policy that Israel has about settlers, our own settlers in the West Bank, is that our sons and sometimes daughters, but mostly our sons, are the ones who end up having to protect them and put their lives on the line to defend these small bands of settlers in the West Bank. So it's not just about a political idea or about what makes the most sense in terms of the border or the green line or diplomacy. It is literally about the lives of our children when we talk about the West Bank, about Gaza. And it's not just about the PR war, whether we're winning or losing or why we're winning or losing. It's about if we're losing the PR war because, related to a topic like aid, we're talking about humanitarian aid coming into Gaza, and the world accuses us of withholding aid as a technique, when the truth is, as I've said before, that aid is all stolen by Hamas. If we need to safeguard that aid, that means putting our soldiers in harm's way to make sure the aid gets to where it needs to go. That's very personal. It's not just about the aid question or the PR question. It's about more of our sons in Gaza having to put their lives on the line to protect aid that Hamas should be letting in as part of the deals we're striking. And at the same time, hostages are not just about the atrocity of the fact that we are nearly 6 months out from October 7th and we still have hostages there, including women and children. But these hostages all have names for us. In my family's case, it's the friend of my other daughter who's now 17. She has a friend who's 20 years old, Naama Levy. I'm sure you've heard her name if you followed the hostage saga. She's in Gaza as we speak. She, at this point, was a soldier and captured on October 7th and has been there, as I said, now almost 6 months. It is so, so personal for us, which is why we are so invested in what's happening day to day and also in the near future. The possibility of this war with Hezbollah, possible reprisals for a strike that Israel carried out in the last 48 hours against two very high up officers in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard in Syria, with Hezbollah and Iran now threatening to enact payback. I mean, this is our lives. It's so personal for us. And I just I want to try to close that divide a little bit between what I see as the world Jewish community and the Israeli one. Um, and just let you know how much this is touching us and causing us angst and anxiety and sleepless nights. And the death of Sivan Weil this past week really drove it home for me and my family. This relates also to news that the world reacts to, but that Israelis react to very differently. And that's our second narrative here. You may have heard about a mistaken Israeli airstrike on a WFK. That's the World Food Kitchen. World Food Kitchen is an aid organization that has now tried to deliver aid into Gaza, and one of their trucks was struck by Israel. At first Israel said we're not sure what happened. We're not sure it was us, and it was. Israel has now admitted that it was somehow a mistake, but we carried out an airstrike on a World Food Kitchen truck, killing 7 aid workers from various countries, including Austria and Poland and I believe Australia. Um, these are people who come to try, they're aid workers who have all the good intentions in the world to try to bring food to Gazans who are starving and who are suffering. And somehow, accidentally, Israel carried out an airstrike on one of their trucks and killed 7 of their workers. And you might be wondering, how do Israelis feel about this? And you've asked a version of this question in the past as well. How do Israelis feel about the fact that 30,000 Gazans have died so far? And I always explain that yes, 13,000 of those are Hamas, but the other 17,000 are women and children and regular civilians. And it's horrible. But I've also said that Israelis are not so focused on it, and we're not so worried about this, maybe as we would have in the past. And I'll tell you, it's the very same with this food truck incident where 7 aid workers were accidentally killed. I don't want to say that Israelis don't give a damn, but when Poland, after this mistaken airstrike, says that this airstrike is a violation of international humanitarian law, what Israelis are thinking is, are you kidding me? We've had hostages in Gaza for 6 months, and the Red Cross has not been allowed to visit them. These hostages have not gotten the medicines that they've been promised. They have been sexually abused and raped, and probably are continuing to have that done. We have Hamas basing itself in the maternity ward of Shifa Hospital. Where is the outcry about that? Where is the outcry about that being a violation of international humanitarian law? So it's not that Israelis like me don't care that 7 aid workers were killed. It's terrible. I wish those 7 aid workers were not killed, but it's the absolute duplicity. It's the hypocrisy of how the world sees this. It's the fact that the world is paying attention to 7 aid workers when we have 132 hostages in Gaza as we speak, and no one is saying a word about that. No one is saying that this is a violation of international humanitarian law. So, Israelis just, we're not as concerned about, it sounds so callous. And I feel like I need to apologize that I sound callous saying this, but I'm just trying to communicate to you where Israelis are at. We see it so differently. It's so personal for us. And when we have soldiers dying, when we have hostages still there, it's very hard to get worked up. And when we know that that Israeli children who've been hostages were beaten and tormented by regular Gazan families, not just Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but by families who were holding them in their apartments and kicking them as they were dragged through the streets, it's very hard for us to feel the kind of sympathy that we might have in the past. So yes, it might sound callous when I'm explaining how we're reacting, but you can't overlook the personal nature of everything that's happening there right now. And it's also why the political situation for us is so personal. And there've been a lot of comments in this thread in the past about how, and people have emailed me that I've called out Netanyahu and I've been critical of Netanyahu. Like, how can you criticize the sitting leader? Even if you don't like him, you should support him. It's not just me. Like, I want you to know how absolutely fed up the Israeli public is with Netanyahu right now. His approval rating is just around 15%. I mean, you really can't get much lower than that. There's always going to be 15% that supports him. And so we're at that rock bottom right now. And I want to explain why. It's because it's so personal. It's because of the way that he has completely mishandled the draft of the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim. This week, there was a law passed. The Attorney General of Israel actually said that funding for yeshivas is now going to be cut off if these yeshivas do not send their students to the IDF. Their students need to be drafted. And if they do not draft, their funding will be cut off. And Netanyahu, behind her back, said that he will retroactively make sure that they receive all the funding they had in the past, which is totally going against the will of the Israeli public. Almost the entirety of the Israeli public believes it is now time for the ultra-Orthodox to do their share and not just reserve subsidies for their children and not just receive money for studying in yeshiva, but to actually serve in the army and put their lives on the line like everyone else. And Netanyahu is still going against that. Many people feel that Netanyahu is responsible for October 7th happening in the first place. Just the fact that he was warned over and over during the months this past summer leading up to October 7th. He was warned by intelligence, by the military, by the Shin Bet and the Mossad that the judicial overhaul that he was trying to enact was sending a signal to our enemies that we were weak and vulnerable. And even in the weeks leading up to October 7th, leaders were saying that we're very vulnerable right now. We must stop this judicial overhaul. It's making us vulnerable to attack. And yet Netanyahu did not listen. And so Israelis still hold that something personal against Netanyahu, thinking that had he not behaved the way he did, that maybe October 7th could have been prevented. And many Israelis, I want to let you know, many Israelis right now feel that Netanyahu is destroying the country. You know, we had a mass rally this past Saturday night, over 100,000 people, and there's now another 4-day sort of sit-in, camping out in Jerusalem, outside the Knesset, calling for new elections. It's not just about bring the hostages home or plan the war differently. It's we want the chance to choose leadership that we feel confident in and that we believe has our best interests at heart. And so when I come to you in this podcast and talk about my feelings about Netanyahu, it really, it's not just me. This is 85% of the Israeli public who feels like this. And again, it's because it's so personal. It's not just about political decisions. Israelis truly believe that Netanyahu is destroying the country and that the Israel we care about and love might be, I don't want to say ruined forever, but is in such a perilous position that we don't know how long it might take to come back from where we are or where we could end up if we keep going down this path. The war doesn't seem to have a plan right now. That's another big feeling in Israel, that we're told over and over that we're going to go into Rafiah, into Rafah, and yet we don't go. We're told we're drawing up plans, and then Netanyahu says we have the plans, but we're waiting to enact them. No one really believes him. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. And we feel like we're in Gaza without knowing why we are there. Meanwhile, our relationship with the US seems to be deteriorating. So Israelis have just lost faith in Netanyahu, and it's very personal because they're feeling it. They're feeling it themselves. So for me, that would be the big takeaway for today, is just how personal everything that's happening in Israel is for all of us, and why it is that we see the news differently from the world community and specifically the Jewish community elsewhere in the world. So some other news that I want to hit on really quick. Israel's negotiating team is now heading back from Cairo. Again, Hamas has rejected Israel's offers. And here, I got to be honest, I don't hold Netanyahu necessarily responsible here. I think Israel is making huge offers to Hamas. 800 prisoners released, with 100 of those having blood on their hands, having committed murder, that were willing to release for just 40 hostages. And again, this was rejected by Hamas. It is more than ever clear to me that Hamas doesn't want a deal at all. And really, why should they? They seem to be winning the PR war. They don't care if civilians die in Gaza. It makes them look like the victims, which is what they want. And meanwhile, the relationship between Israel and the U.S. is deteriorating, which is absolutely fine with Hamas. So they really have no motive at this point. Now, that said, from all of these prisoners that we have been arresting in our operations, including the over 500 at Rafah, what we are hearing from them after their interrogations is that Hamas is falling apart. This has been this is corroborated evidence. It's not just one or two, but many of the Hamas militants that the IDF has been capturing have been saying that Hamas is falling apart and that they're really on their last straw. They're about to crumble, which is why so many Israelis and the military feel that we need to push ahead with an operation in Rafah, and why we're frustrated that it is not happening yet. But in that sense, Israel does seem to be winning the war in Gaza. We just want to see it go ahead to its completion. But at the same time, to bring in the hostages, we do not feel that a deal is going to bring back the hostages right now. At least I don't. It would seem that military pressure is the only way. I mentioned this earlier that Israel killed 7 members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. This is a terrorist organization, by the way. It might sound like a branch of the military, but the United States has deemed the IRG a terrorist organization. And of the 7 members who were killed on this airstrike in Syria, 2 of them are actually generals in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. These were major officers who served in top positions, and let's put it this way, the last time that such a high officer was killed was in 2020, when the United States took out one of the top generals in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. And the fact that the United States took out one of their generals just 4 years ago, that communicates to me how absurd it is that Israel and the United States are not lockstep moving forward hand in hand with respect to the war in Gaza. It is so clear to me that Israel is doing what America needs Israel to do, which is to take out Hamas, take out one of the most lethal and dangerous and brutal terrorist organizations on the planet. The United States is taking out the same members of IRG, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, that Israel is. It's such a clear partnership. And yet, still, American politicians are communicating this sort of wishy-washy feeling toward Israel. And to me, that's ridiculous because we really are doing the dirty work that Israel needs us to do. What is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard? They carry out the radical policies of radical Islam, enforcing those policies. And they also coordinate operations between all of Iran's proxy military groups. So you have Hezbollah in Lebanon and in Syria, ISIS, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, sort of all these groups that do the bidding of Iran. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard is the one trying to coordinate. So that's why it's very important that we took out these 2 leaders. And also, it's a sign to Hezbollah. A lot of this is in response to Hezbollah's attacks on northern Israel, which have not let up, and which I've said before lead many Israelis to believe that this is a precursor to a war that is on the horizon. Right now, we're looking at late May, early June. That's what we're hearing for this war with Hezbollah. I mentioned this earlier that the Attorney General ordered that no more funding should go to yeshivas in Israel where the students are not drafted into the IDF. This is going to be a huge point of contention moving forward in Israel. Just yesterday, we had several hundred ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews once again blocking Highway 4. Why is it always Highway 4? This is one of the main highways through central Israel, and it passes through Bnei Brak and Givat Shmuel. Givat Shmuel is more of a modern Orthodox neighborhood, but Bnei Brak is an ultra-Orthodox Haredi neighborhood. If you've ever driven through central Israel past the Coca-Cola factory, that is Highway 4, and that is exactly where they camped out and blocked traffic once again. And as they have been in the past, they were violent with police officers, kicking them, telling them to go die in Gaza. They were holding signs that said Russia Zekan, which means Russia is here, kind of the idea being like we're back in Russia. This is the height of Jews being brutalized by communism. Uh, they're not part of the state, and I want to on this theme of personal. This is so personal for Israelis because, like I said, it's our sons and daughters who are now serving longer in the army than ever. Soldiers who are about to get out just got notified that they are now serving 4 extra months of their military service. The age of reserve duty has been raised. And meanwhile, the ultra-Orthodox are not serving. It's very personal. And as I've said before, I do think that there will be Jew-on-Jew violence. It seems to me that this draft issue, it's not a minor annoyance to the ultra-Orthodox community. They truly do not want to serve and see it as their right to not have to serve. And I suspect they will be violent if forced to serve. To me, this is as mysterious. What's going to happen is as big a mystery as what would happen when we go into Rafah. In fact, I feel that we have a clearer idea of what would happen when the IDF goes into Rafah than we do of what would happen when the IDF actually does begin to draft ultra-Orthodox Haredi soldiers. Those were the news items from this week that I wanted to touch on, and I want to get to a few of your questions. I again, one time, sometimes people email me saying, "Why didn't you get to your question?" I try to get to as many as I can, but I also have to limit them and I try to bundle some of them together. Many of them are similar, so please don't take it personally if I don't get to yours. But here are the ones that I chose for today. So Robert asked, regarding Netanyahu, should elections take place immediately, who would likely replace him? And how, in fact, is it most likely that elections would happen before they're scheduled to happen? Well, Benny Gantz, all polls show that Benny Gantz would be the one who would be prime minister if elections were held today. The coalition that he would be able to form would have 74 seats. You need 61, which is half of 120 plus one to have a majority, and he would have a clear majority with 74. I think the better question, Robert, that you asked is how would these elections actually happen? Well, there's a few ways. One is we can wait another 2 years until the elections are scheduled to happen. So that's one way that elections could happen. Another is if Netanyahu were actually going to resign. And that is, I would say, absolutely unlikely to happen. The third scenario, which many are talking about may be a possibility, would be that if these mass protests grow, so let's say it's no longer just 100,000 marching on Saturday nights. Let's say it grows to 200,000, 300,000 all over the country. What would happen then is that members of the Likud party who are very far down on the list might start realizing that they won't have a political future if they stick with Likud as it is. So they would jump ship and leave the ruling coalition, at which point Netanyahu would no longer have the 61 seats required. Perhaps those jumping ship would form their own political party or start to run with already existing political parties that are close in ideology to theirs. But it's not likely that leaders of Likud would leave the Likud faction. It's more likely that those lower down on the list. And I should explain that in Israel, you don't vote for people. You don't go into the booth and punch for a name. You don't even vote for the prime minister. You vote for the political party. And depending on how many seats that party gets after elections, that's how many members from their list get to serve in the Knesset. So if they only get 3 seats, only the top 3 people on their list will serve in the Knesset. So when we talk about the Likud members at the bottom of the list, these are typically politicians who aren't very well known and don't have a very strong reputation and who are only there because of the big names at the top of the list. So if they see that they won't have a political future with the current administration, they would jump ship. And that is the most likely scenario for having early elections, is if there really were a groundswell of protests that were probably at least double of what it is right now, which is 100,000 on Saturday nights. If it were double that, then it's likely we could see some jump ship. And I think Israelis are encouraged. The reason judicial overhaul did not happen in the end was because of these mass protests, Saturday night after Saturday night for 8 months. the protests in the end did work. So we have faith that it's worth doing if we do want a new government. So Brenda asked, if you pulled the Jews from the West Bank, wouldn't that be creating another Gaza there, one that is more centrally located? How can peace be obtained from this type of separation? And Brenda, this is a great question. And I know you're asking this because I have many times said that I think we should pull the Jews out of the West Bank and really have a two-state solution. So yes, you're right. If we pull the Jews from the West Bank, to an extent, that would create another enemy right next to us. My argument would be that you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And it's easier to respond to an enemy that has a clear border that can be breached, as opposed to an enemy that's where the border is murky and vague, and you don't even know really where the border begins and ends. Iran is our enemy, but at least they have a clear border where we know that if certain lines are crossed, it means war. Same with Lebanon and Hezbollah. Same with Syria. And I feel that we have an opportunity right now to create a state in Gaza and the West Bank that would at least make them responsible in the world's eyes. If we pull the Jews out of the West Bank and there is a state there that is Palestinian, then the world knows that they've finally gotten what they wanted, a two-state solution. And if they attack after that, there are no more arguments about al-Nakba. Nakba is the catastrophe when Israel became a state in May of 1948. There are no more arguments about the Green Line and pre-1967 borders. If there is a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank, that part of the argument is settled. In any attacks that come from there after that, there's no occupation to blame, there's no blockade. All of these other excuses that the world buys into, those are gone and those are moot. And I think we have an opportunity right now. This relates to a question from Andre. What can Israel or the world do to pressure the Arab world to step up to the plate and look after Gaza and the West Bank? I think the Arab world, some of it certainly continues to hate Israel and always will, but some of it wants peace. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, they want peace with Israel. They want to be part of this new Middle East that is economically viable and brings wealth to the leadership and to the people. They don't care. It's not that, well, they kind of don't care about the Palestinians. They want that question to be settled. And the world has for a long time wanted there to be a two-state solution, but never have we been in a position where so many nations around the world wanted to help us form this two-state solution and would have our back in helping to maintain it. Now, how exactly would they help us? I'm not exactly sure, but everyone has said that this Palestinian state needs to be demilitarized, which is a non-starter for us. Of course, it needs to be. So that is why I think that despite the chaos and the pain, this is an opportunity and we need to have separation, because at least when we have separation in a clear border, then the excuses for attacking us are gone. And then we can respond with full force if they do. It's very hard to respond with full force when we have Jews living in the West Bank. So here's a question from another Robert. And this is sort of off topic, but I think relevant nonetheless. He says, I know your podcast is about Israel, but I would love a couple of minutes for you to talk about delicatessens. I'm curious whether Israelis like deli food the same way we Jews like it here in the US, and if the concept of delis exists in Israel. That's a great question. Definitely off topic, but I like it because it opens up our eyes a little bit to what daily life is like there. And the truth is that Israelis are not at all into the delicatessen thing. I mean, zero. I can't remember the last time I saw corned beef in Israel. Maybe it exists in one restaurant in Jerusalem, one restaurant in Ra'anana or Modi'in, where you have a large American population. So it's sort of like their, home away from home. We do have one place in Ra'anana where I live called Holy Bagel, which is a great bagel place. I mean, it's not like New York bagels, but they're pretty good bagels, and you can get lox and cream cheese and all the fillings. But it's the only one I know of in Israel. And those bagel places, those delicatessens, you don't see them in Israel. That is not part of When we think of Jewish food, yes, that's how you might think of Jewish food here in North America, but that is not Jewish food in Israel. In Israel, there really is no Jewish food. It's just Moroccan food and Yemenite food and whatever heritage you are from. I happen to be married to a Yemenite Persian, and man, my eyes were opened up to what Jewish cooking could be after marrying a Sephardic Yemenite Persian Israeli. You know, I grew up with chicken straight out of the oven, no spices, man, gefilte fish, matzo ball soup, and to suddenly be having kube and kubane and these incredible spices. Um, I think it's healthy for Israel. It's what's led to Israeli cuisine being loved and enjoyed around the world. And to answer your question, Robert, no, that old-timey Ashkenazi type of food just doesn't really exist in Israel at all. But despite that, I still hope you'll come and pay us a visit. And I noticed one question here from someone who said, Alexa, we're going to Israel for Passover. Should I worry? Staying in Bat Yam with my in-laws. Bat Yam, as you may or may not know, is in the center of the country. The center of the country is fairly safe. I would not recommend going north. I mean, you can't go north. You could go south to take a tour, and they're opening up more parts of the south. Sderot is now open for people to move back to and live in. And I encourage you to go down to the south. The site of the Nova Party is now open. It's deemed safe that you can go down there and see the site of it and tour some of the kibbutzim who were destroyed. That's important to do. In terms of your itinerary and your being there, I think if you stay in the center of the country, you will be safe. You know, I talk to my kids every day. I'm in the US right now, and when I call them back in Israel, we barely even talk about what we call the matzav, the situation. We talk about school and activities and how much money they need from me, you know, the typical dad kid stuff. Most people go about their daily lives feeling safe. I think you asked the question in response to the war that I mentioned is coming. You know, Israelis talk about war like we talk about the weather. You know, it's heating up in the north does not mean the temperature. It means relations with Hezbollah. And everything I'm hearing right now is that any war in the north would probably take place well after Passover in May or in June. We really need to finish Gaza first. But as for Passover, I would encourage you to go. And I personally think you would be safe. And that goes to the summer tours as well. You know, we're trying very hard in the Jewish world to get teenagers to sign up for their summer tours to Israel. And the best way to do it is by promising them that their itineraries will change, but this will be a different type of experience. They're going to Israel during one of the most pivotal times in its history. And so while you might not see some of the events and places that you would in the North and South in normal times, it's still a very special time to be there. All right. I want to thank all of you for joining me tonight. Again, I'll be at the Hebrew Institute of White Plains tomorrow night at, I believe it's 7:30 p.m. But if you use this link right here, you can register. I would really love to see you there. Come up and say hi and tell me that you're a podcast listener when you come. Again, I uploaded my first bonus episode called Inside Israel Explained about Daniel Kahneman. Check that out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts. The links to that, it's all in one simple place. That's joelchasnoff.com/podcast. That is your one-stop shop for everything. It's also where you can get the links to this weekly broadcast. Next week, our broadcast will most likely take place on Tuesday night, though I'm not sure. It might be Wednesday. I still don't know of my tour schedule. Actually, thinking about it, it'll be Wednesday. It'll be Wednesday, the 10th of April. So mark down 8 p.m. Eastern Time next Wednesday, April 10th. I'll, of course, send an email on Thursday, Hebrew is Magic, reminding you, and again next Wednesday during the day. Keep your questions coming. I love hearing from you. And tonight was a very polite and congenial chat. Thank you for being such a kind audience. I love having you, and I'll see you next week. I'll leave the chat open for a few more minutes so you can talk amongst yourselves. Signing off tonight from New York City, I'm Joel Chasnoff. Thanks for joining Inside Israel. I'll see you next week.